Hello, I am Raymond Shadow. Imagine this, friends. You are placed in a world where, regarding your existence, my existence, everyone's existence, actually, no one feels confused. There are some things that ordinary people really don't lose sleep over. Because for these questions, they have pre-reinforced answers innate to their default daily lives. For instance, ordinary people probably wouldn't stay up until 1 a.m. agonizing over why they grew eyeballs, right? Why do I have these eyeballs? These glass marbles coated in viscous liquid embedded in my skull? Why must I blink constantly? That's to prevent the eyes from drying out. You dummy! You have to keep them moist. You idiot, don't you understand? Why do we have to keep them moist? For what purpose? Why? No one does that. But interestingly, this isn't the only thing about our existence that we take for granted. Why do we have ears? Why do we have hands? Why do we have to breathe? For ordinary people, these things have very obvious functions. When they examine themselves, they see eyes that can draw a rough map of the world to help them navigate. They see ears that help them maintain balance and hear the water buffalo lurking behind them, ready to ambush. The obvious functions of these things make it so that these questions don't really become things ordinary people desperately seek answers to. But Nietzsche would ask, what are the questions people do frequently seek answers to? What question does it seem almost everyone asks at some point in their life? That is, what is the meaning of my life? What is the meaning of the universe? What role does my life play in the grand scheme of things? Everyone asks this. And the mere fact that so many people find themselves asking this question suggests that this question doesn't have a simple or obvious answer that ordinary people can grasp quickly, unlike when they ask themselves about the purpose of their eyeballs. Nietzsche would say we aren't born with some innate knowledge that gives us the answers to these questions. Nor did God put up a billboard off the 405 freeway with the answers to these questions written clearly on it. Given that so many people are born into this situation with no obvious answers, Nietzsche would ask, shouldn't you expect to see the vast majority of people holding a nihilistic view of the universe by default? Why is that not actually the case? Why is it actually almost the opposite? The vast majority of people do believe their lives have some preordained purpose. And the nihilists are just that group of sad, depressed people in the corner of the cafeteria where black nail polish seems to be a major feature of their lives. Isn't that an interesting question? Fortunately, Nietzsche believes he has the answer to this. He says the reason most people aren't nihilists is that when you grow up in this world and start asking these questions about the purpose of your life, historically, people have always had another option. When you find yourself a contestant on this game show about the nature of existence, door number 1 is nihilism. Nietzsche would say historically, you always have door number 2, one of the hundreds or thousands of variations of what he calls true world theories. Let's talk about these true world theories. What are they? Well, we've seen them in philosophy. Remember Plato and the transcendent world of forms he described? Just a brief recap, basically, Plato was studying geometry one day and he realized something. In the world of mathematics, one can imagine the concept of a perfect triangle. The idea of a perfect triangle. A perfect three-sided shape whose internal angles add up to exactly 180 degrees, right? That is the absolutely perfect representation of what it means to be a triangle. We can all picture that perfect triangle in our minds. In other words, we can use our rational faculties to grasp the idea of that perfect triangle. But does that triangle actually exist anywhere in the world? We certainly don't see that perfect triangle around us. If some explorer led an expedition deep into the jungle, would they encounter some glowing, perfect, ideal triangle like it was the Ark of the Covenant? No. What actually happens is that we do see things around us all the time that are triangles, maybe a leftover slice of pizza on the roof or a shard of glass on the kitchen floor. But these things aren't perfect triangles. They just, to some degree, resemble being a triangle. They are imperfect representations of that concept of the ideal triangle. Plato thought everything in the world was like this. For example, for some reason, you can look at a bonsai tree, and then immediately look at a giant redwood. Even though they look extremely different, for some reason, there is a similarity between them. You recognize something that makes them both trees. That is treeness. Some essential attribute that makes both of these things trees, even though they look so different. If you are Plato, the conclusion you draw from this is that everything in the world is just a crude reflection, everything is an imperfect representation of some ideal form of that thing. Plato thought, why not encapsulate all these ideal forms into a hypothetical realm he called the world of forms, or world of ideas. It seemed like a pretty good name at the time. But think about what Plato is implying here. He's saying that this world we live in is actually just a world of appearances. It is a cluttered collection of crude, flawed reflections of these ideal forms. This world is nothing but the earthly shadow of a truer world. That truer world, accessible through reason, is called the world of forms. This world of forms is what Nietzsche refers to as the true world in this specific true world theory. So, this other world we live in, this earthly, physical world of appearances, becomes secondary. Now, as a point of comparison, let's talk about another example of a true world theory that Nietzsche mentions. Let's talk about one we are all a bit more familiar with, the worldview ascribed to the New Testament and dozens of modern Christian interpretations. Similar to Plato, Christianity also talks about the existence of two distinct worlds. There is a world of the flesh, an earthly realm. This is kind of like a moral obstacle course. You know, your behavior while navigating the hail of bullets of this mortal existence. And whether you can convince yourself to believe Jesus healed lepers, that ultimately determines your fate in that other world of existence. That more important world. Heaven, where we all want to win a spot. I mean, think about the relationship between these two worlds. Actually, you are an eternal soul. An eternal soul temporarily inhabiting this body as a test, just to inevitably go to that other world. If you're lucky, you get to exist in this world for 70 to 90 years, while in the other world, it's eternity. This temporary earthly world is full of things you don't want: pain, death, temptation, anxiety, depression. Those things don't even exist in the other world. One thing is for sure, nothing you experience in this earthly world can compare to the majesty of God waiting for you in the other world, if you can win a spot there. Despite all the obvious flaws of this physical world, heaven is ultimately the world we should focus on. In this true world theory, heaven is the true world. Let's look at one more example: Hinduism or certain types of Buddhism. You know, just as a single wave is merely a temporary manifestation of the ocean, it would be wrong if someone categorized the wave as somehow separate from the ocean. No, it is the ocean. In this sense, we as individuals are also a bit like waves, temporary manifestations of something else. Brahman, or the universal whole, or the spiritual realm. The bottom line is that the individual self is an illusion. Everyone and everything in the universe is ultimately one. We are just different manifestations of this greater ocean. Nietzsche would say, just like in the Christian heaven, just like in Plato's world of forms, the same theme starts to emerge in this worldview, right? There are two distinct realities, one inferior, one illusory. Our work in this life is to transcend this world of appearance and access this other reality where we can grasp our true selves. In that world, the problems of the self become secondary, they are things we need to overcome to transcend the illusory world you were born into. That is accessing the true world in this specific true world theory. History has created hundreds, if not thousands, of these true world theories. By the way, it's not just philosophy and religion making them. You can do this by looking forward to some Marxist utopia you want to bring about, or some racist utopia. Really, anything works. The deeper point is that Nietzsche would say it's no coincidence at all that there are so many fundamental similarities between all these true world theories. It's almost like a formula. There are things about this world we actually live in that we don't like. So, to make ourselves feel better, we manufacture one of these true world theories. We say this world is just temporary, or this world is just an illusion. There is another world out there, and we should really focus our attention there. Don't worry about this world, it sucks anyway. To Nietzsche, these true world theories are human inventions. They are a common strategy people use to satisfy various psychological needs humans often have. Some people will object to this, saying, "Really, Nietzsche? Really? Thousands of different people throughout history just made these up to fill a psychological void? And they all happen to come up with the exact same idea." What Nietzsche would say is, yes, they certainly did. This is a universal problem faced by all of humanity. Think about any other universal problem humans face. Think of a universal problem where we created inventions to solve it. What's an example of that? Moving lots of heavy stuff around, right? It seems obvious that no matter where your specific ancestors decided to settle and try to survive for thousands of years, they probably didn't like carrying a bunch of heavy stuff around all the time. So what did they do? Well, every group of people came up with their own creative way to solve this problem. The wheel, rolling things on logs, wheelbarrows, wagons, rickshaws, animals, you name it. The point is, having to move a bunch of heavy stuff is a universal human problem, and every culture came up with its own slightly different way of dealing with it. Nietzsche is saying here, what is another universal human problem? Oh, right. What is the meaning of my life? These true world theories are kind of like wheelbarrows and wagons. They are clever human inventions that solved a universal problem we all face. Nietzsche says there's actually nothing new about recognizing this. I mean, people obviously knew long before him that these true world theories were basically all the same thing. He says the reason this situation has been able to persist for so long is that scientists and philosophers haven't always had the best strategy when refuting these true world theories. He says what usually happens is someone will present a proof for the existence of God, right? Anselm or Aquinas will present some proof. In the past, philosophers would just point out all the assumptions they were making. They would show that this isn't actually a knockdown argument for God's existence. Once they did that, they were done. They certainly didn't go in the opposite direction. They didn't prove that God doesn't exist. That's not what science or philosophy does anyway. Given the problem of induction, I don't know if you can prove God doesn't exist. What Nietzsche is saying is that in the past, this always allowed someone who believed in one of these true world theories to say, okay, well, Anselm's proof of God didn't hold up. But that doesn't mean there isn't another proof out there that justifies my worldview. They certainly haven't disproven what I believe one. This is Nietzsche taking a slightly different approach to the same problem. He too's not trying to prove God doesn't exist. He's not even trying to say it's impossible for one of these true world theories to be true. He is simply saying, understand the very real motivation for people to invent a story to make themselves feel better about some unfortunate realities. He says once you realize this fact, once more and more people realize this fact, something is bound to happen. He said this in one of the most famous lines in the history of philosophy. He said, God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must for we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of I5T? Now, listen to that tone. It's not what most people expect when they hear it for the first time. It really doesn't sound like Nietzsche sitting there gloating, clapping his hands, hey, look what I did. No, he is saying this with regret. He isn't literally talking about the death of a deity. He is talking about the death of humanity's pursuit of some objective morality. He's saying, look, in the past, whenever you had a question about what the meaning of life was, or how you should act, throughout history, you always had a ready-made answer to answer all of life's painful questions. But as the world becomes more scientific, as the average person becomes better educated with better critical thinking skills, as people become increasingly aware that advances in psychology show these true world theories are just that, essentially, we have created a world where it has become almost impossible to be a rational person while simultaneously believing in one of these true world theories. He is saying it is becoming increasingly difficult for someone to use these inventions that solve this human problem. It is becoming increasingly difficult for someone to convince themselves that a man walking on water, dying, and coming back to life 3 days later is a reasonable proposition. Nietzsche is terrified of what this means for the future of humanity. I'm sure we can all understand where he's coming from. I mean, just imagine if you woke up one day and all the things we have to help us move heavy objects stopped working. Imagine if those inventions just didn't work. No cars, no trucks, no wagons, no trains, nothing works. Now imagine, for some reason, we lost the ability to invent new things to solve this problem. Well, in that world, we would all have to accept the fact that carrying all these heavy objects all the time is just an unfortunate reality of our lives. Well, analogous to this hypothetical world, there is now an existential burden that everyone must shoulder. This is something we all need to learn to accept. Easier said than done. Nietzsche ultimately believes that a person who accepts the reality of their existence is far better off than someone who manages to convince themselves to believe in one of these true world theories. Not just on a personal level, but simply because he thinks these theories inherently breed complacency toward what is happening in the world you live in. For example, someone might commit some terrible crime and get away with it. They might do something horrible, and someone who believes in one of these true world theories might say, well, the Lord will get them eventually, and go on with their day. Sure, that makes you feel better in the moment. But just think, if you're wrong and the Lord doesn't get him one day, what are you doing? Think about what happened. Someone was wronged or taken advantage of right in front of you, and you didn't stand up for what you believe in. You didn't possibly make the world a better place. You just threw your hands in the air. Oh well, forget this world. The Lord works in mysterious ways. I guess I'll just sit back and wait to be beamed up to heaven. Scotty's up there for me, right? He says this isn't the best recipe for progress. When you read that quote, you know, God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. One thing you might think is that Nietzsche is unfairly picking on the God of Abrahamic religions. You know, the patriarchal God is a man, and we killed him. It might seem that way. But this is really just his way of illustrating a point. Make no mistake, he has issues with all these true world theories that have been listed. In fact, you could even say he's more afraid of the secular true world theories because usually they aren't based on any moral agenda. What I'm trying to say is, in that quote, he isn't specifically singling out Christianity. But it must be said that Christianity holds a very special place in Nietzsche's heart, specifically. He views Christianity as an exclusive club people like to join. It gives members all these fringe benefits. First of all, you can walk around with a sense of moral superiority over everyone you meet. That's great. You can look down at the ground, furrow your brow, and slowly shake your head left and right. No, no. Whenever someone behaves in a way you wouldn't do, you can do that. But Nietzsche would say, look at this code of ethics they think is so great. What is it, actually? Nietzsche calls it slave morality. He says becoming a Christian means you become part of a herd. They all become the same kind of well-intentioned, quiet people who don't want to cause too much trouble. People full of confidence and optimism about the situation I am also in, with the same glazed look in their eyes. But Nietzsche thinks the very code they follow ultimately strips them of most of their individuality. It turns them into a member of this herd. At the same time, it justifies every shortcoming they have as a person and regards it as virtuous behavior. Nietzsche says when you want to become who you truly want to be, or live the life of your dreams, one of the most powerful forces you can have is envy. To Nietzsche, envy is you looking at someone else and realizing they have something you don't. I want that. Why do they get to have that and I don't? Nietzsche would say, why do we usually consider envy such a bad thing? If we want to become the best versions of ourselves we can be, it is one of the most powerful tools we have. Think about what envy is. When you feel envy, that is a momentary spotlight projected onto something you truly want but currently don't have. It is a contrast between the person you most want to be and the person you are now. When you do that, Nietzsche would say you don't have to hate that person. You can admire them. You can use that feeling of envy as a guide. A guide to what areas you should focus on if you want to be a better person. If you envy the luxury car some rich person has, you don't have to throw a brick through their window just because they have something you don't. You can use that envy as fuel. Fuel to work as hard as possible to make that car your reality. You see, envy is really cool because it's highly personalized. You created it. You will never envy someone for having something you don't want. It is always the discrepancy between who you most want to be and who you are now. In that sense, the things we envy can teach us a lot about who we are. Nietzsche says let's give credit where credit is due. One thing Christianity is very, very good at is teaching you to reject all these natural feelings of envy and convincing you that weakness and passivity are virtues. Nietzsche would say Christians are humans just like everyone else, right? They feel the same impulses as everyone else. They also want to go out and become super rich and successful and live lavishly. They also want to be well-liked and have tons of friends and admirers. But instead of admitting all their impulses, and admitting they don't have these things because they are lazy, or not smart enough, or just had bad luck in life, instead of admitting those impulses, their strategy is to reject them, make them evil, and then turn not being the kind of person who goes out and tries to do these things into a virtue. If you aren't brave enough, and you really have trouble working up the courage to talk to new people, don't worry. The meek shall inherit the earth. If you want to be richer and more successful than you are now, don't worry, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Nietzsche would say these virtues, forgiveness, humility, obedience, and all the others, they are nothing more than a way to justify passivity. To turn you into a member of a herd instead of an individual. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, Nietzsche, you sure are rambling on about how other people live their lives. What should I do? What am I supposed to do? Just fall into a nihilistic depression constantly thinking about how meaningless everything is. Forcing myself to cry every day so the eyeliner runs down my pale cheeks? Well, the short answer to that is no. But I think a really interesting topic isn't what Nietzsche thinks we should do, but one thing he thinks we shouldn't do if we really want to be happy in this world. One thing Nietzsche thinks we should never do is drink alcohol. To understand this, let's talk about the pros and cons of drinking. Let's think about what the benefits of drinking are. Well, for probably an hour and a half, you feel really good. You feel euphoric, confident, silly. Now, I'm trying to think, is there really anything else we can put in this pros column? I mean, even that hour and a half is just happiness borrowed from the next day. You'll feel miserable the next day. You can point out tons of cons. Alcohol is extremely bad for your liver, nervous system, and brain. Consider for a second the fact that we are in a culture where not only is drinking socially accepted, but if you don't drink, you're the weird one. When you look at how prevalent this behavior is, how many people are doing it, there can't just be one benefit in this pros column, right? Well, Nietzsche would say, no, of course not. There is another benefit. It's a big benefit. It's that drinking instantly solves all your problems. Except it doesn't really solve them, it just makes you feel like all your problems are solved, right? Nietzsche has a famous quote where he says, there have been two great narcotics in history, Christianity and alcohol. What he means by this is that he constantly sees people around him condemning Christians. Oh, those are just weak people. Oh, those are just people who want all their problems solved. They are too weak to ever face the reality of their existence like me. The audacity. They say these things while chugging a pint of beer. Nietzsche would say, how is what you are doing any different from what they're doing? You are numbing yourself to escape all the pain that comes with examining your place in the world and realizing any shortcomings you might have. This alcohol tells you the status quo is just fine. But in reality, there are tons of things wrong. You wish you could be more confident in social situations. You wish you could take yourself less seriously, see the comedy in things, and laugh more. Regardless of what alcohol does for you, you are human. You very likely have problems that it is masking. And if you are truly interested in becoming the best person you can be and being as happy as possible, Nietzsche says you should view all these negative emotional states as opportunities for growth. Every time a thought pops into your head like, "Oh God, I feel really awkward," instead of drowning that feeling with alcohol to give yourself instant relief from the problem, realize that internal monologue is a huge catalyst for becoming the best person you can be. All you are doing is running away from an opportunity for growth. He says this is a very seductive trap. Utilizing alcohol, like he sees people utilizing Christianity, as a means to convince ourselves that our problems don't actually exist. And avoiding the pain of becoming a better person for the rest of your life instead of facing your problems head on. But instead of talking about things you shouldn't do, let's talk about things you should do. A great introspective entry point for this discussion is to ask yourself the following question: why do you do the things you do? Whatever you do, what is the primary psychological motivation? When you talk to people, a very common answer, a very Aristotelian approach, is that whenever someone is doing something, they are ultimately doing it because they think it will bring them happiness. Now, some people will argue with this, saying, "No, that's not me. My life is about sacrifice. My life is about serving others." Now, a lot of people would counter that. Okay, no matter how much pain you put yourself through for others, ultimately you are doing it because it brings you some kind of positive emotional state. But others would counter that. They would say, if people really only do things because it makes them happy, why do we see people constantly engaging in behaviors they know exactly will make them unhappy? I'm talking about things like guilt, envy, or hatred toward others. No one says, "I'm going to sit there and resent them for weeks on end, wallowing in my own misery. I'm going to do this because it makes me happy." So why do they do that? Well, some people would say, a very Schopenhauerian approach, that it all boils down to survival. A will to life. This process of guilt, like many other processes we don't enjoy in the moment, usually aids our survival. But Nietzsche would say survival doesn't really seem to explain the whole reason people do things. I mean, if we really only made choices to ensure our survival, why would anyone go skydiving? Why would anyone drive a car? We see this in the animal kingdom too. If the goal was really just to ensure our survival at all costs, why do animals take unnecessary risks? Why don't we just see them get food and water and then stay in a little cold bag where they never venture out so they don't die? No, it's not a will to happiness. It's not a will to life. Everything we do is in pursuit of a will to power. We are all looking for power. Now, a quick note on power. Everyone will come to this episode with their own conditioned definition of it. What does he mean by power? I'll tell you what he's not saying. He isn't talking about electricity. He isn't talking about military power. He isn't talking about getting more strength, like lifting heavy weights at the gym to build your body. The best phrasing I've seen is that power is becoming your true self. Often phrased as self-expression. Not being enslaved by things. To clarify what Nietzsche is talking about here, maybe a good place to start is to look at the animal kingdom. When you step back and look at that process we are all a part of, how does life usually manifest? Well, a bear or a frog or trees and plants, these things are all driven by the will to power. Their goal is to fully express themselves. That self-expression is usually improving their quality of life. Controlling certain variables that might make their situation better or worse. If an animal is in the middle of the woods, merely scraping by to survive, they don't feel a rush of satisfaction just because they are alive. No, they try to improve their situation, even if it means taking risks. Nietzsche says we are the same way. It shouldn't surprise us that we are the same. Now, there are many different interpretations of Nietzsche. But perhaps the most interesting, or at least the most thought-provoking, is this concept of the will to power and how far it extends. Some would say Nietzsche believed this will to power not only explains the motivation behind human behavior, but that it also extends to the entire universe. They would say this will to power is the metaphysical basis. Actually, this was a popular way scientists thought about the universe when he was alive. The general idea is that physical matter, like atoms combining into molecules combining into substances, these things aren't the fundamental building blocks of existence. There might be some underlying force, some invisible thing, of which physical matter is just one manifestation. For example, if you barbecue in the backyard, you light the charcoal. A few hours later, you come back, and the charcoal is gone. Where did the charcoal go? Are you a magician? No, the carbon in the charcoal converted into heat energy. As we see often now, physical matter is kind of like a savings account for energy. It's not that the stuff making up the charcoal ceased to exist, it's just dancing in the sky after being converted into heat energy. Now, some would say Nietzsche is using this concept of the will to power as a similar invisible thing that can explain the behavior of everything in the universe. From people to supernovas to that red, terrifying storm raging on the surface of Jupiter. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, think about what this means if it's true. In other words, because we as humans are things in this universe, just like stars or distant nebulas, is it possible that we can observe the nature of our own experience very carefully and potentially learn something amazing about the nature of everything else out there? Do we hold the secret of the universe right in front of us, just haven't looked at it correctly? Let's look at a passage from Nietzsche on life and nature. Imagine a being like nature, wasteful beyond measure, indifferent beyond measure, without purpose and consideration, without mercy and justice, at once fruitful and barren and uncertain. Imagine indifference itself as a power. How could you live according to such indifference? According to nature means nothing other than according to life. Valuing, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different. Wherever I found the living, there I found the will to power, and even in the will of the serving I found the will to be master. Life itself confided this secret to me. Behold. It said, I am that which must always overcome itself. Indeed, the one who shot at the truth with the word will to existence did not hit it. This will does not exist. For what does not exist cannot will, but that which is in existence, how could it still want to come into existence? Only where there is life is there also will, not will to life, but, so I teach you, will to power. Life values many things higher than life itself, but out of the valuing itself speaks the will to power. But what all parties interpreting Nietzsche seem to agree on is how important this concept of the will to power is in understanding why people do what they do. So here is the problem: the will to power isn't a single thing you can point to. It isn't even a single set of behaviors. It really can be anything. The best phrasing I've seen is that power is becoming your true self. Often phrased as self-expression. Not being enslaved by things. Maybe a good place to start is to look at the animal kingdom. When you step back and look at that process we are all a part of, how does life usually manifest? A bear or a frog or trees and plants, these things are all driven by the will to power. Their goal is to fully express themselves. That self-expression is usually improving their quality of life. Controlling certain variables that might make their situation better or worse. If an animal is in the middle of the woods merely scraping by to survive, they don't feel a rush of satisfaction just because they are alive. No, they try to improve their situation, even if it means taking risks. Nietzsche says we are the same way. This shouldn't surprise us. Our problem is that we just make things way more complicated than the bear. Think about the bear in the forest. When the bear wants to control its situation more, when it wants to stop the wills of other animals from interfering with its will, should this bear meditate day and night trying to eliminate all these earthly attachments it has? Or would you say, no, exercise your will to power? Go get what you want, Mr. Bear. Historically, when philosophers have tried to figure out what the solution to this problem is, 99% of the time they came up with some variation of the same idea. The idea is that you cannot control the external world, all you can hope to control is the internal world. The ultimate goal of many of these practices is to reach some sage-like state. A state where you have completely accepted your lack of control over things in the external world. A state where you have eliminated all earthly attachments. Nietzsche would ask, why is completely detaching from the world the pinnacle of being human? Why is going up a mountain for 30 years and coming down wearing an orange trash bag, telling everyone how detached you are, why is that something worth pursuing? Nietzsche would say this isn't how people actually experience the world. In fact, we are attached to things in the external world. Given that, why should we have the opposite approach? Why should we train our minds for 30 years just so we can accept how powerless we are in the face of our circumstances? Nietzsche would say, no. Control your circumstances, or at least try. Work tirelessly, exercise your will to power, and overcome those circumstances. You want to live according to nature? Oh, you noble Stoics, what fraud of words! Imagine a being like nature, wasteful beyond measure, indifferent beyond measure, without purpose and consideration, without mercy and justice, at once fruitful and barren and uncertain. Imagine indifference itself as a power. How could you live according to such indifference? Is that not precisely wanting to be different from this nature? According to nature means nothing other than according to life. Valuing, preferring, being unjust. Being limited, wanting to be different. To Nietzsche, viewing life as a constant struggle for satisfaction with what we already have is to deny the kind of creature we actually are. The only way to achieve the highest level of happiness is, like the bear in the woods, to take calculated risks. To live dangerously. For believe me, the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas. Live at war with your peers and yourselves. Be robbers and conquerors as long as you cannot be rulers and possessors. You seekers of Knoll 6DGE. The time will soon be past when you could be content to live hidden in forests like shy deer. In other words, embrace danger. Embrace risk as a catalyst for the best life possible. But I guess the most important thing we should learn to embrace from Nietzsche is suffering. Nietzsche would say, no, you just said it. Suffering is certain in this existence. Look, there is a 100% chance you will reach the end of your life having experienced a significant amount of pain. That seems certain. But when people face that reality, what do they usually do? They flee from pain. They spend a lifetime trying to be as comfortable as possible. But instead of fleeing from pain, instead of fleeing from the suffering that accompanies that pain, Nietzsche wants us to ask, what purpose is that pain supposed to serve for us? Pain and suffering are not things to be avoided. They are the only way we grow as people. He talks about a mountain. He says climbing the mountain itself is full of all struggle, right? It's terrible. For hours you are gasping for air, muscles burning, struggling up the side of this mountain. Going through tons of pain and suffering along the way the whole time. But only from the top of that mountain can you see the most beautiful view life has to offer. This is a metaphor for having the best life you can possibly have. Just like climbing a physical mountain, the only way we are going to experience the fullest and most joyful life is by going through intense suffering, hard work, and pain in whatever endeavor we choose. He says there seems to be a direct relationship between the intensity of the valleys you go through and the intensity of the peaks you can reach. Nietzsche would say by putting yourself through all that pain over the years, by overcoming all that suffering, the satisfaction you feel from accomplishing your goal, that awesome feeling, is kind of like the awesome feeling you get when you summit a mountain. And one other thing, only those with the courage to summit that mountain ever get to see that view. So, with this perhaps somewhat disturbing picture of what life is and who we are as creatures, is there such a thing as the good life? Let's look at some examples of the good life. I think this might be instructive. Nietzsche would suggest that if we want examples of the good life in the Nietzschean sense, we should look at figures like Goethe. A true Renaissance man. He describes Goethe as a magnificent attempt to overcome the 18th century by a return to nature, by an ascent to the naturalness of the Renaissance, a kind of self-overcoming on the part of that century. Goethe conceived a human being who would be strong, highly educated, skilled in all physical matters, self-controlled, reverent toward himself, and who might dare to afford the whole range and wealth of naturalness, being strong enough for such freedom, the man of tolerance, not from weakness but from strength, because he knows how to use to his advantage even that from which the average nature would perish. The man for whom there is no longer anything that is forbidden, unless it be weakness. Whether called vice or virtue. Such a spirit who has become free stands amid the cosmos with a joyous and trusting fatalism. In the faith that only the particular is loathsome, and that all is redeemed and affirmed in the whole, he does not negate any more. Such a faith, however, is the highest of all possible faiths. or we could consider a non-artist. A completely non-theoretical person. In fact, he was praised by Goethe mentioned earlier, and equally praised by Hegel and many intellectuals of his time, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon emerged from the chaos and excess of the French Revolution, producing a new French Empire. Nietzsche mentions the idea of a return to nature. I too speak of a return to nature, although it is really not a going back but an ascent up into the high, free, even terrible nature and naturalness where great tasks are something one plays with, one may play with. Napoleon was a piece of return to nature as I understand it, for example. In rebus tacticis, in tactical matters, even more, as military men know, in strategy. What he calls high, free, terrible naturalness refers to a person who has recaptured this sense of innocence and is therefore free to follow the commands of his own will. This driving will is beneath all of us. There is always this tendency for some of us to break out, try to be different, and define ourselves individually. But how many aquatic creatures suffocated on the surface of the water until some of them mutated into forms capable of enduring more exposure to the oxygen atmosphere, right? So progress requires immense sacrifice. As the passage points out, we always have to pay for this somehow. But the passage gets even harder. Wherever I found the living, there I found the will to power, and even in the will of the serving I found the will to be master. That the weaker should serve the stronger, to that it is persuaded by its own will, which would be master over what is weaker still, this is the only pleasure it does not want to renounce. And as the smaller yields to the greater, in order to have delight and power over the smallest, thus even the greatest yields, and stakes his life, for the sake of power. It is the surrendering of the greatest. It is hazard and danger, and casting dice for death. And where there is sacrifice and service and love glances, there too is the will to be master. By byways the weaker steals into the castle, and into the heart of the more powerful, and there steals the power. Life itself confided this secret to me. Behold, it said, I am that which must always overcome itself. Indeed, you call it a will to procreate or a drive to an end, to something higher, farther, more manifold, but all this is one, and one secret. Rather would I perish than forswear this, and truly, where there is perishing and a falling of leaves. Behold, their life sacrifices itself, for power. That I have to be struggle and becoming and purpose and contradiction of purpose, alas, whoever guesses my will guesses also on what crooked paths it must proceed. Whatever I create and however much I love it, soon I have to oppose it and my love, thus my will wills it. And you too, lover of knowledge, are only a path and footprint of my will. Verily, my will to power walks also on the heels of your will to truth. Indeed, the one who shot at the truth with the word will to existence did not hit it. This will does not exist. For what does not exist cannot will. But that which is in existence, how could it still want to come into existence? Only where there is life is there also will, not will to life, but, so I teach you, will to power. Life values many things higher than life itself, but out of the valuing itself speaks, the will to power. So, at the end, we see the refutation of Schopenhauer's will to survival or will to life. We have this idea that life is that which overcomes itself. Life sacrifices itself for power. This is the fundamental nature of the will to power. It means life itself is will to power, is self-overcoming. Life is judging, valuing, becoming different. As we would derive if we extrapolated from another passage, the basis of all this is physiological preference. And therefore, the essence of life is valuing. Another way of putting it is the way he puts it at the end, to be alive is to value. If we are to be the measure of things, all life must be so for itself and its kind. Then we must self-legislate that good. Just as the eagle must determine its own good, and the sheep must determine its own good, right? But we humans are a bit different because we value perhaps more forcefully and subtly than any other being. That is why our will to power travels on crooked paths. Even those in a position of slavery have their ways of gaining power over their masters. We can find expressions of the will to power in the most subtle ways, whether in charity and patronage, or in deceit and infidelity. All sorts of human behaviors and inclinations present themselves to our cognition as completely independent of this fundamental characteristic of life. We hide it behind ideas like seeking truth. But the high valuation of truth, just like our valuation of any phenomenon, speaks to the fact that valuing itself is our nature. Judging, valuing, measuring is nature. It is the prerequisite for any such valuation. In this fundamental activity, we see the essence of the will to power, the willingness to impose our standards on reality and then manifest those standards with force. When we zoom out and consider the whole picture of life, life as a whole is always doing this. Meaning life is constantly judging which forms or modes of creatures are worthy of esteem and which are not. As long as this war of all against all continues to happen across generations of life forms, devouring each other, competing for feeding grounds and breeding rights. So, with this perhaps somewhat disturbing picture of what life is and who we are as creatures, is there such a thing as the good life? Nietzsche would clearly say yes. Though his conception of it changed a bit over his career. In his early days, he believed life could be justified aesthetically. As he wrote in The Birth of Tragedy. This makes sense. If life is basically arbitrary valuation at the level of immediate perception, why can't the good life simply be the beautiful life? If we are living according to savage preferences, why not aesthetic preferences? The specific form of aesthetic preference Nietzsche advocated was what we might call the tragic view of life. This was the perspective cultivated in ancient Greece through dramatic tragedy. Tragic art. A joyous fatalism in the face of one's own destruction. We can better understand this view by what Nietzsche opposed. He opposed the so-called theoretical approach, which began with Socrates. In The Birth of Tragedy, he wrote about the cultural divide between the theoretical and the tragic. Theoretical life is a life lived according to reason. This view holds that human problems can be solved in a lasting way through reason. Human social life can be improved through reason. It is basically a form of optimism. Its best representative is Socrates because he provided the strongest, most notable case for this worldview. The important point in all this is that Socrates' view, to Nietzsche, is ultimately an aesthetic view. Socrates was driven to the bone by an irrational valuation of truth. This is Nietzsche's fundamental critique of him. I think one can trace all sorts of paths of thought just from the explosive quality of that initial statement. It contains the seeds of all of Nietzsche's later philosophy. But anyway, so, in The Birth of Tragedy, he portrayed Socrates as completely non-artistic. But in his later prefaces, he clarifies that Socrates' irony was exactly that thing. Namely, that he irrationally valued truth above all else. This itself was an expression of Socrates' underlying nature. His arbitrary demand on life. He demanded that all reality be bound under a universal rational principle. All superstitions and illusions of prejudice were forbidden because, under this Socratic aesthetic, those things were ugly. So this was all Socrates' aesthetic judgment. What is the problem? Is that, oh great ironist, perhaps your irony? Now, Nietzsche's opposing aesthetic is a pessimistic view. Again, Nietzsche believed he was a rather positive representative of this view because he believed himself to be a pessimist of strength. Therefore, the tragic worldview is an affirmation of the characteristics of life we just discussed. Fully aware that this requires embracing one's own decline. We accept no narratives of optimism or moral redemption regarding life. Wholeheartedly embracing the fact that entropy always wins. Life is short. The good die young. Bad things happen to good people. Pride goes before a fall. History is a series of cycles of rising followed immediately by falling. Just as all living things are born and then die. But people don't count these honest, certain aspects of every human life as an indictment against it. Tragic aesthetics, on the contrary, is defined by emphasizing the beauty inherent in the fundamentally entropic nature of life. Viewed as a whole, the story of a tragic figure is somehow beautiful to us. Nietzsche believed this experience happens when we engage with tragic art because we are confronting the terrible reality of life in such a way that it doesn't immediately destroy us, right? So we feel that through the experience of tragic art, we have overcome the terrible nature of the world by encountering it and surviving. Marked by using a word that is heretical in this context, transcending it. Turning it into art. Experiencing beauty or the sublime. Now, Nietzsche didn't stick with this answer about what the good life is. Because this answer, like any other answer about what the good life is perspective. To really answer this question in general terms, we have to turn it into a meta-question. The late Nietzsche finally concluded in a mindset that belongs more to that meta-world. This relates to his understanding of what every attempt to create a good life is. And that is the will to power. The will to power manifests in Socrates' quest for truth to practice virtue, just as it manifests in the Christian spirit of loving your enemies and non-resistance to evil, or the Buddhist spirit of renouncing selfish desire. All of these are forms of self-overcoming. All of these are attempts to impose a judgment upon the world. Then Nietzsche investigates the direction in which this transformation proceeds, or how these judgments of the world ultimately manifest in human life. The reason he does this is that he sees the element of will to power in all these answers, and how each starts from a different perspective, right? But it is always manifesting this will to power thing. I think he was able to see that his own attempt to impose an aesthetic judgment on the world wasn't actually anything novel or innovative, or an innovative concept. It was simply what every religion has always been trying to do. The real question we should be asking is, why do all these existing aesthetics no longer work for us? That might be one way to express it. So, what do these various morals and religions produce? In a strong sense, Nietzsche is very empirical here. All the various manifestations of the will to power have these basic characteristics we've described. But not all manifestations are created equal. Therefore, some ways of life are stronger, some are weaker. Or we could say, healthier or sicklier. Or to use language we've used before, some are ascending paths of life, meaning these are expressions of strength that produce more strength. But some are descending, which represent a degeneration into weaker and weaker forms. So it's still an expression of your strength, but it's an expression of your strength that doesn't produce more strength but produces weakness. So it's the difference between a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop. So the good life is a positive feedback loop. That is the healthy life in this life-affirming sense. Right, we should remind ourselves at this point that while this statement does have a very figurative dimension, it also has a very literal dimension. Because what is the root of all this still? Physiological. Our judgments and preferences happen at that physiological level. So the strength with which a person commands their drives according to such an ascending life will manifestation, that is determined at the physiological level. If we are to take seriously the view that humans are bodies, that we are what we manifest in all observation and direct perception of the world, then we are physical beings. And our psychological life, in the sense of psychology, right, and our social life and moral life, all of this flows from the source of our own nature, producing our conditions, aspects of our temperament. But another way to look at it might be, perhaps, how much physical vitality we have. Or we could say, how much vitality we have left. Nietzsche believed that weak or self-sabotaging moral values are ultimately the product of an exhausted, degenerating people. This is true for them physiologically and psychologically in a sense. So that is the root of everything we are looking at. So we view it in a physical sense. On the other hand, it is entirely possible for a young and otherwise physiologically healthy person to hold a weary or degenerate view of life. And life is not a static thing. Again, it is not being. So we cannot ask if someone's way of life is obviously healthy right here and now and be done with it, right? We have to view people as human becoming, not human being. Viewed as a dynamic process. It is forever unfolding and never truly static. So, just like everything, we can't really say if a life is healthy until we know what it leads to. What it produces, right? So in pursuing the good life, we must always remember, what matters is what we spend our life on. What direction we are moving in. What we are bringing about. If we try to hold on to our life or keep it as it is now, out of devotion to the instinct of self-preservation, we will always fail in that task, right? When it's all over, you will disappear anyway. All that remains is what you have produced. This isn't really a choice. However, so what is the good life? For Nietzsche, we are still answering this question. With all these pieces in place, we can say, this is where the concept of the Übermensch comes into play. The good life, in short, is living in a way that brings about the Übermensch, Superman over man. This simply means living in such a way that your life aims to bring about something greater than yourself. It means living in longing for something that transcends your current horizon. It means being willing to make sacrifices. This, Nietzsche emphasizes a lot. To spend yourself and your life. Spend your vitality. In this, the Übermensch is the promise of humanity's redemption from all errors. I dare say it is a faith. A faith that ascending life triumphs over degenerating life. It is a faith in positive feedback loop life. So can we say in general terms what that good life looks like? I mean, we see it in Zarathustra's prologue. And the tightrope walker. The clown. I mean, the literal translation is rope dancer. It roughly corresponds to what we call a tightrope walker. But in German, there is the word dancer. So, you know, that is very important because in Nietzsche, dance is such a metaphor. You know, expressing that deepest happiness. Anyway, the rope dancer, this somewhat clown-like character, this jester, spends his life in the practice of his dangerous art. He dies performing his art. And Zarathustra, you know, praises him in a sense. This is Nietzsche's cry to us, live dangerously. Build your temples on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. So be completely dedicated to the great passions of your life. And be honest about what drives you. This is something you may need to spend years exploring and reaching some understanding of. Many great and dangerous experiments. See what happens when you let certain drives take the helm, so to speak. So, let's look at some examples of the good life. I think this might be instructive. Nietzsche would suggest that if we want examples of the good life in the Nietzschean sense, we should look at figures like Goethe. A true Renaissance man. I mean, he wrote beautifully in every literary style. Expanded the possibilities of the German language. Possessed a vast catalogue of poetry. Goethe stood as a soul torn between classical aesthetics and the fiery passion of Romanticism. Or we could consider a non-artist. A completely non-theoretical person. In fact, he was praised by Goethe mentioned earlier, and equally praised by Hegel and many intellectuals of his time, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon emerged from the chaos and excess of the French Revolution, producing a new French Empire. In this process, he constructed the modern French state. And statistically, he is the most efficient military commander to date, by far. So, just as Goethe reshaped the German artistic landscape in his own image, Napoleon reshaped the French political landscape in his own image. These people dared to command. To follow the dictates of their will and impose their judgment. This is a risk, a danger. As Napoleon said, when fortune no longer smiles on me, she will smash me like glass. But you know, most people can't compare to these examples. Many will fail. Some will succeed like Caesar. But in their moment of triumph, when their victory has barely taken a breath, they meet their downfall. But in the image of such people, whether we find it attainable or not, we might find inspiration. To try to emulate the good life. In Twilight of the Idols, we find this passage mentioning Napoleon and talking about him in the language of an ideal for ascending life. Nietzsche mentions the idea of a return to nature. I think there he is mainly refuting the Rousseauian ideal of what such a thing means. Progress in my sense. I too speak of a return to nature, although it is really not a going back but an ascent up into the high, free, even terrible nature and naturalness where great tasks are something one plays with, one may play with. To use a metaphor, Napoleon was a piece of return to nature as I understand it, for example, in rebus tacticis, even more, as military men know, in strategy. So he mentions there Napoleon's extraordinary record as a tactician. And the fact that he was a person who seemed to act on intuition, right? So Nietzsche often talks about great and terrible individuals, right? We can understand this description in many ways. But ultimately, I think the important point he wants to make is the essentially innocent nature of all our drives. Innocent because they are natural. Innocent in the way an eagle eating a small field mouse is innocent, right? What he calls high, free, terrible naturalness refers to a person who has recaptured this sense of innocence and is therefore free, can follow the commands of his own will, because he is liberated from the imposition of guilt or the imposition of moral condemnation on those drives. So yes, such a person might end up doing things we call evil. But that is by no means the point Nietzsche is talking about here. You know, Napoleon's greatness wasn't due to body count, right? That would be quite pathological. The point of living the good life isn't to do evil things. I mean, that is, moralists will try to scare us into thinking that is what any faith in life and the world implies if detached from transcendental or divine purpose. But Nietzsche? Nietzsche is simply asking himself to be honest with us here, and admit that returning to innocent humanity actually means contacting a part of ourselves that is passionate, imperious, sometimes even violent and unreasonable. In the next section of Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche gives his assessment of Goethe. Goethe, not a German event, but a European one, a magnificent attempt to overcome the 18th century by a return to nature, by an ascent to the naturalness of the Renaissance, a kind of self-overcoming on the part of that century 78. He bore its strongest instincts within himself. The sensibility, the idolatry of nature, the anti-historic, the idealistic, the unreal and revolutionary, the latter being merely a form of the unreal. He called to his aid history, natural science, antiquity, and also Spinoza, but above all practical activity. He surrounded himself with limited horizons, he did not retire from life but put himself into the midst of it, he was not faint-hearted but took as much as possible upon himself, over himself, into himself. What he wanted was totality. He fought the mutual extraneousness of reason, senses, feeling, and will, preached with the most abhorrent scholasticism by Kant. The antipode of Goethe, he disciplined himself to wholeness, he created himself 11. In the middle of an age with an unreal outlook, Goethe was a convinced realist. He said ye12s to everything that was related to him in this respect, and he had no greater experience than that ens realissimum, most real being, called Napoleon 13n14. Goethe conceived a human being who would be strong, highly educated, skill 15 ed in all physical matters, self-controlled, reverent toward himself, and who might dare to afford the whole range and wealth of naturalness, being strong enough for such freedom, the man of tolerance. Not from weakness but from strength, because he knows how to use to his advantage even that from which the average nature would perish, the man for whom there is no longer anything that is forbidden, unless it be weakness, whether called vice or virtue. 16. Such a spirit who has become free stands amid the cosmos with a joyous and trusting fatalism, in the faith that on 17 lie the particular is loathsome, and that all is redeemed and affirmed in the whole, he does not negate any more. Such a faith, however, is the highest of all possible faiths. I have baptized it with the name of Dionyse. So, in very clear terms, Nietzsche calls Goethe Dionysian, but in a very specific sense of the Dionysian spirit we've talked about. So when comparing and contrasting the figures of Napoleon and Goethe, surely both are candidates for what Nietzsche calls the good life. We have a more or less adequate picture of what it looks like: naturalness, directness, and a trusting fatalism. Of course, you know, both created something great beyond themselves. This was the imposition of their creative will on reality. But the fatalism aspect. You know, elsewhere Nietzsche criticizes a fatalistic attitude. That is, the fatalism of the oppressed. Or like, fatalism in bondage. He contemptuously calls it Mohammedan fatalism. But this trusting fatalism he describes is different. It is trusting life, trusting necessity. Feeling that everything is redeemed in the whole, right? In the big picture, life is more beautiful than ugly, we can say. And you know, fully aware of the danger Napoleon brought upon himself, but indifferent to it. He pursued this ambitious path of life. That is a perfect example of trusting fatalism. The fruit of such a natural, healthy life is freedom, gratitude, a sense of joy. But notice it isn't, when we talk about a free and natural life. Remember, when Nietzsche describes Goethe as returning to nature, he has already said what that means. His concept of what that means is a nature that is essentially violent and dangerous. However, those who most profoundly clothe themselves in this life role become something almost beyond human. More like a cataclysmic event. A shockwave shaking an entire continent. A force reshaping an entire culture, initiating an entire art movement. In this context, perhaps we can look at the third question: what promotes the good life? This is actually a question about Nietzschean virtues. For those of us who wish to live a healthy life, he has some solid wisdom. To live with tremendous and proud composure, always beyond. To have and not have one's emotions, one's for and against, at will, and to remain master of one's for virtues, courage, insight, sympathy, and solitude. For solitude is a virtue for us, as a sublime bent and impulse to cleanliness which guesses that all contact between man and man, in society, must inevitably involve some impurity. All community makes men, somehow, somewhere, sometime, common. Besides these four, Nietzsche also mentions honesty in another book. Daybreak. Honesty with oneself and anyone who is a friend, brave to the enemy, magnanimous to the conquered, and always polite. These 7 basic Nietzschean virtues are a list of virtues as good as any religion has produced. Perhaps better than any religion has produced because we have solitude as a virtue. Opposite all these virtues, Nietzsche is often wary of something many view as a virtue: justice. Zarathustra says in the chapter on the tarantulas that for the cultural warrior who cares completely about justice, what actually stands behind that word is the desire for revenge. Zarathustra says the bridge to his highest hope for humanity is that humanity will be delivered from revenge. Because in this world as will to power, we find no guilt or moral responsibility. So if we are faithful to the virtue of insight, we take into account in our feelings and actions involving others that everyone we meet is completely innocent of any wrongdoing. What we encounter are merely manifestations of the will to power pushing and pulling us, or attracting and repelling us. The person who hurts you is no more immoral than a hurricane hurting you. When all is said and done, the virtuous person maintains a certain degree of equanimity, knowing that everything that happens is absolutely necessary and would happen the same way every time. This is a means of maintaining a certain spiritual or emotional cleanliness. Because the most dangerous thing to the spirit, the most corrupting influence, is the influence of resentment, ressentiment. Resentment doesn't aim to create anything or bring anything about. It merely aims to destroy. It is directed outward, it is negative in its orientation. So a life-serving resentment is very useful for providing one of the many counterexamples to what the good life is. Indeed, there are some topics people like to tell themselves they have settled. One of the most common is the concept of love. We all feel like we know what love is, we've all felt it before, right? Some people even push this to the extreme. Some say, all you need is love. You mean? 100 years ago, my child might have gone to the grocery store and used 4/10 of a penny to buy an ice cream cone without permission. When he came home and I saw the chocolate on his face, at that moment I might say to myself, you know what, I love this child. I won't allow him to become someone who doesn't understand the value of discipline for the rest of his life. In the name of love, I must beat him. The point is, the way people treat those they love is highly influenced by the cultural context they were born into. Perhaps love is actually a quite complicated thing that needs to be deconstructed. When it comes to philosophers writing about love, by far the most famous description of love in history has to be Plato's description in his work The Symposium. Diotima tells Socrates that she views love as a progression. It is a progression up the rungs of a ladder. The first kind of love you will experience, the first rung on this ladder, is what she calls physical love. Once you are in this place of loving someone's body, if you start to look more closely at that feeling you have for this person, what inevitably happens is you start to notice that the things you like about this person's body are in no way unique to them. Eventually, what happens is after we have had enough of these conversations with them, you start to realize that love isn't as superficial as you initially thought. Diotima says what you realize is that there is a deeper kind of love available to you. That is loving a person's personality, or as she calls it, the soul. Now, it is precisely in these two initial stages that most people spend their entire lives. Most people will probably stick in a relationship too long, telling themselves this person is their soulmate. Then one day when it all burns down, they will tell themselves, maybe this next person is my one and only someone. This brings us to the great Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's view on love has multiple layers. On one hand, he tries to get us to question how selfless we actually are when we love someone. But on the other hand, he isn't condemning anyone for falling in love. Usually, when people talk about loving someone, they say things like, love is caring about someone more than you care about yourself. I am completely selflessly devoted to this other being. Nietzsche would say, how convenient for this person to work so hard to portray themselves as so selfless. Because do you know what real love is? When you look at it closely, love begins to strongly resemble greed. He says, how different the feelings evoked by these two terms are, greed and love. Yet this might be the same instinct with two names. Once disparaged by those who already have and in whom the instinct has somehow calmed down. And another time seen from the perspective of those who are unsatisfied but still yearning. Therefore, they glorify this instinct as good. We often view greedy people in a negative light. But what if love and greed are the same instinct manifesting in different ways? At the root of both these words is this instinct or this desire for something to be ours. Or as he puts it, to turn something new into ourselves. For example, let's say you are a huge fan of Italian sports cars. You save up, and you finally have one parked in the driveway outside. Another guy comes along, maybe he likes Italian sports cars too. Maybe he wants that Italian sports car parked in the driveway. This guy is going to do anything to make it his. Maybe he's going to try to find some way to convince the state government to take your sports car away from you so he can have it. Not crazy to think you might feel this guy is being a bit greedy. However, as a car lover yourself, if in your travels you encountered the same car, you would definitely want it. In that context, you would only view how much you want that car as your love for the car, and not you being greedy. Now swap the Italian sports car for your significant other. Notice the similarity. Nietzsche isn't judging you for that. He isn't saying this makes you a bad person for loving someone. He thinks love, like everything else, is will to power. When two people fall in love, yes, for Nietzsche, they are both just greedily desiring to turn something new into themselves. But regardless of whether it's greedy or not, Nietzsche thinks love and friendship are some of the most wonderful things life has to offer. He says you should find someone to love, enjoy all the very real benefits of loving someone. Just look a bit closer at why you are actually doing these things. Don't try to justify your behavior with a nice-sounding story you like to tell yourself. So what is this constant pursuit toward becoming the Übermensch? Nietzsche believes that each of you, if progressing constantly as a human being, will go through three major developmental stages in a lifetime. The first stage is becoming the camel. The second stage is becoming the lion. The third stage is becoming the child. We are all born as camels. In Nietzsche's view, 99.9% of people will die as camels. He calls the first stage of life camel-like because when you look closely at most people and how they interact with the world, they behave as if they are beasts of burden bearing hardships without complaint. Think about a day in the life of your average friendly neighborhood camel. People come over, put a pile of heavy stuff on their backs, and tell them not to complain too much about it. They say, listen, forget what you want to do, camel. I'm telling you what you're going to do. You're going to help me carry all this weight to the exact place I tell you to carry it. Nietzsche would say these weights strapped to your back are lies. And if we really want to be free, we need to unload them. Every single thing you do, down to the tiniest detail, if the only reason you do it is because at some point in your life someone told you that was the way you should do it, then it is very likely one of these weights you carry around your whole life as a camel. Nietzsche says at a certain point, a few lucky people look at all these weights they were given when they were born as camels, and they understand their nature. Tradition. And the thing about tradition is that you don't necessarily need to follow it. No, you can say no to tradition. The moment you reach that level of maturity where you can say no to all these ways people told you need to live, that moment you enter the second stage of life. You have become the lion. The ultimate task of the lion is to slay a giant fire-breathing dragon. That dragon keeps the lion under its control. The name of this dragon is Thou Shalt. On every scale of this dragon's skin is carved something you must do, some way you must behave. One scale will say something like thou shalt not stare at strangers. Another will say thou shalt cover thy mouth when thou sneezest. Through rigorous introspection and honesty, the lion, if it wants to enter the third stage of life, it must summon the courage and strength to slay that dragon named thou shalt. Understand the nature of these traditions. Respect these traditions. If in the future you choose to act according to one of them, now you do so because you freely chose to do so, not because you are under the control of some dragon. But tell me, my brothers, what the child can do, which even the lion could not do. Why must the praying lion still become a child? The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, my brothers, a sacred yes is needed. The spirit now wills his own will, the one lost to the world now conquers his own world. Remember, when you are the lion, all you are doing is saying no to everything others told you to do. When you are the child, this requires you to say yes to some things. It is living in a state of near constant life affirmation. Nietzsche calls this stage the child because he thinks when we are in it, since we don't have all these weights on our backs telling us how things are, we are almost like children playing, discovering the world for the first time. Think about what children are like when they play. They are a little bundle of energy, they are all over the place. They aren't thinking about what will happen later that night. They are just pure life affirmation. They are enjoying this game they are playing right now in the moment. When that game is over, they move on to the next game. Only in this place of excitement to discover a new game to play or discover a new way of looking at things. This place of not just living the same day over and over again, but living a life where you aren't afraid to take risks, this place of wanting something instead of running away from it and telling yourself you can't do it, the place where you affirm life, where you are even willing to risk your life to get what you want out of this world. Only in this place can we truly become masters of our own desert and begin to create our own values. Once we accept that life really needs to have some finitude, at that point, whether life is long or short. I mean, who can say? It has to end sometime. Life cannot last forever in order for it to be life. So let the inevitable end serve as that drive to sweeten every moment. Let it be a drop of honey on top of everything, right? Nietzsche gives us a pretty direct answer in section 96 of Beyond Good and Evil. One should part from life as Odysseus parted from Nausicaa, blessing it rather than in love with it. I mean, he presents his ideal attitude as celebration and gratitude. Grateful to have been granted that encounter with beauty, right? But not becoming depressed and melancholy about having to leave this experience. Instead, doing it voluntarily and with lightness. The certain prospect of death could sweeten every life with a drop of precious and fragrant frivolity, and now you strange apothecary souls have turned it into a heartbreaking drop of poison that makes the whole of life repulsive. So the inevitability of death that we perceive in mortality can either hang over our heads at every moment like the sword of Damocles, allowing this thought to invade us constantly, thereby ruining all happiness, joy, and satisfaction we might have. Or why can't we view it in a lighter way? As something natural, something we should view with humor. You can view death as the end of the play that reveals the meaning of our life to us. That insight of eternal existence is actually quite torturous. That might be another way we could look at it. Nietzsche says try to imagine your life like this, take a second and really look at your life. Imagine if after you died, you had to live the exact same life you just lived. Down to the smallest detail. In the exact same way. Over and over again until the end of time. Imagine that just by doing something, you are essentially sentencing yourself to do that decision over and over again for the rest of time. If that decision causes you pain, you are sentencing yourself to eternal pain. If it causes you happiness, eternal happiness. In that world, when you view your life that way, how precious every decision you make in your limited time becomes. This is Nietzsche's ultimate challenge. To accept life to the point of demanding the eternal recurrence of the same life. It is a challenge that will energize the strong but will break and paralyze the world-weary. To live with the sincerity of that creative innocence Nietzsche described in the happiest and noblest moments of his work. To live in such a way that when you reach the end of your life, you know you would be happy to do it all over again. The attitude we should have when we face death, as Nietzsche describes quoting the Greeks, someone said, was that life? Well then, once more. Nietzsche, in his autobiography, seemed to foreshadow exactly what happened to his work after his death. He said, "I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without precedent on earth, the most profound collision of conscience, a decision that was conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far. I am no man, I am dynamite." When we hear this, we might wonder if Nietzsche is saying to us, "You know what, young man? I used to be like you. I used to think I knew everything about the world. But maybe, just maybe, this whole life thing is actually much bigger than that. Maybe 100 years just isn't enough time to become as proficient at things as you want to believe." We've talked for a long time today. I am Raymond Shadow. I'm very glad to have spent this time with you. Feel free to like and subscribe. Let's talk again next time.